Welcome back to the urban farmyard where this city girl goes country. It's been a rough week here at our animal rescue. Unfortunately, we have had a litter of newborn kittens born and we've ended up losing almost all of them. So today I thought I'd take you along the journey that I've been on throughout this week. Let's go take a look. Well, one of the difficult things with animal rescue, which I don't often talk about, is the fact that we unfortunately don't manage to save all of the cats and kittens that come into us. We do our very best and we often spend a small fortune on vet consultations, but sometimes their little bodies are just not up to it. And unfortunately that has been the case with a gorgeous litter of kittens that arrived into us this week. This mum cat was a little colony cat. She was born as a stray and she was found living in a suburban area that was surrounded by a gorgeous bush area. And unfortunately this little group of cats had just been left to breed over time, and eventually one of our partner rescues stepped in and started the process of trapping them. When they started the trapping process, they discovered, as is expected at this time of year, that quite a few of the girls were pregnant. So I agreed to take all the pregnant girls from this particular colony. And among them was this lovely tawny tabby girl. She was enormous when she came in and we couldn't quite believe that she hadn't already had her babies. After about a week of being here, finally she went into labour. I had just taken a sleeping tablet. I was just about to go to bed because I had an early start the next day and I heard the sound of tiny kittens, and she had by this stage had 1.5. So I made a cup of tea, I went into the room, and when I say she'd had half a kitten, one was stuck during the birthing process. So my first job was to help the little one out. Now, as soon as these two little ones were born, I could see that they were pretty small. They looked as though they were slightly premature. And I could also see that Mum wasn't showing a great deal of interest in them. So what I did is I wrapped them up, I popped them on a heat pad, and I left them with her so that she could continue to give birth to the rest of the litter and hopefully show some interest in her babies. I went and checked on them every half hour to see how things were going, and I could see that no other babies had been born, but she also still wasn't doing what she should be doing, crawling up to them and starting to lick them clean so that they were nice and dry. So what I ended up doing is making the call a few hours in to dry them off and pop them in with Mum. Mum really wasn't happy about my hands being in her cage. She attacked me several times. I came away bleeding, but you know what, that is par for the course, unfortunately, when you're dealing with a nervous mum. At that point, I just left them and I went to bed and I hoped for the best. And by the next morning, I was delighted to find that she had had another 3 babies, so 5 in total. From that point though, unfortunately things started to go downhill. A few hours later I came back to discover that only 3 babies were still alive. One had passed away and was lying beside her, and another one she unfortunately had half eaten. This again is something which can happen in all cats, whether they be wildlings or whether they be pampered pedigrees. Sometimes Mum will attack and kill her babies, and at this point we weren't sure if this is what was happening. It later turned out that that probably wasn't the case and they were actually dying of natural causes, and Mum was then eating them afterwards. Unfortunately, this is something that they do. It's a natural instinct which helps to protect the rest of the litter from predators. They get rid of the carcasses of their dead babies in order to avoid predators coming and taking them and potentially taking the rest of the litter. This was incredibly sad for the 2 little ones who had passed away, but I made the call at that stage to just remove their little bodies and leave Mum with the remaining babies. Whether or not that was the right call, I don't know at this point. It's a really difficult decision when you're going through it to let Mum keep her babies, not knowing whether she's attacking them or whether to take them away from her. I don't like to interfere as much as possible. I do like to try to leave the mums with their babies. I can only imagine the grieving process that they must go through when they're full of hormones. They've just had a litter of babies and they've all disappeared. So I made the call at that stage to leave her babies with her. Unfortunately, the next day another baby completely disappeared. There was no body, no remains, so I can only think that this little one had passed away, and unfortunately mum had eaten the third baby. At that point, I did make the call to remove her last two remaining babies from her. They were really little. She was showing absolutely no interest in them. She wasn't nursing them in the way that I would expect. She was more sort of lying on top of them and they were crawling around her. She wasn't rolling onto her side in order to nurse them, which is something that our mums usually do. So fortunately, I had 3 other mums with young babies of similar ages, so I made the call to take her 2 remaining babies and put them in with a mum who I knew was doing an exceptional job of raising her own babies. And fortunately, she took to them right away. She sniffed them, she gave them a lick, and she immediately let them crawl into her to feed. Now, there was quite a big size difference between these little ones and her own litter, but I knew that she was a tried and tested mum. She'd done an amazing job with her own babies over the last week, and so I decided that the better option was to let her raise these little ones. At that point, I just left her to it, and unfortunately we discovered at this point that we did have an underlying issue with the litter that had been born. Another baby did pass away overnight. It simply crawled away from her. I tried to feed it. I sat up with this little one for hours, administering fluids, administering formula via syringe, and administering electrolytes. Unfortunately, sometimes these things just don't help. There's only so much supportive care that we can provide, and sometimes there are just simply underlying things that we're not aware of which prevent these little ones from surviving. So at this point, we had just 1 baby remaining, and I've got to say this little one is still hanging in there, still fighting to live, and is still feeding really well. So it's been a tough week here. It's always difficult for me when we don't manage to save the little ones that we're looking after. It's particularly difficult when you're short on sleep and you've spent hours sitting up with them, administering fluids and formula and trying to keep them alive. It's also really difficult when you have to go and remove the little bodies, especially when mum has started eating them. It's just one of the unfortunate things about rescue that unfortunately we need to deal with. But we are delighted that at least 1 baby has survived, and hope that that little one will continue to thrive with his foster mum. So I hope today has been interesting, and I will see you back here tomorrow.